The first scream tore through the mountain village before dawn, and I felt the cold air seize my lungs as Lydia Markovic clutched her mother's shawl, its worn threads trembling between her fingers. Riders swept through the narrow streets with ruthless efficiency, their silhouettes rising and falling like shadows cut loose from the hills. Lantern light flashed across polished helmets and glinted along the stone walls, breaking into fractured beams that scattered across the snow. Somewhere behind us, a wooden door slammed, followed by another cry. A monk's ledger, preserved years later in a monastery archive, recorded that several Christian families vanished that night, their names crossed out with trembling ink that revealed the fear of the scribe as clearly as it revealed the loss itself. Lydia stumbled as soldiers urged the captives into a line. Her breath broke in short, trembling bursts, clouding the air with pale, ghost-like shapes. She whispered a prayer into her palms, a prayer meant for courage but strained with terror, her voice cracking as she struggled to steady herself. Her younger brother tried to reach her, but an elder pulled him back, warning him with a desperate shake of the head. The riders tightened their formation, and the clatter of bridles rang through the square like a grim announcement of fate taking shape. Snow churned beneath the hooves, softening the sound of hurried footsteps as villagers fled from one doorway to the next. Torches flickered against the wind, their flames bending like frightened children. Elders gathered near the well, arguing in harsh whispers. Some insisted that any form of resistance would bring slaughter upon all. Others demanded that they defend what remained of their community. In the end, indecision silenced them more effectively than any command. Lydia's father, Marco, stood at the edge of the path with his hands shaking so violently that the leather strap of his satchel slipped from his grasp. He watched his daughter in the line of captives with an expression that revealed a man torn between two impossible duties. His wife pressed her forehead to his shoulder, begging him to stay, yet Marco could not remove his gaze from Lydia's pale face. He was forced to choose between remaining in the village to protect those still within reach, or following the caravan in the hope of keeping sight of his daughter. He took one step forward, then another, but the riders pushed the caravan into motion. Snow rose behind them in swirling clouds, erasing their footprints as they disappeared into the dark valley. Marco stood unmoving, swallowed by the silence they left behind, haunted by a question that settled over the village like an unanswered prayer. Would any of them ever return? Anna Petrescu rode in the center of the forced convoy, wrists bound with coarse rope that scraped her skin raw. I walked close enough to hear the uneven rhythm of her breath as wind scattered dust across the plains, stinging her eyes until the horizon blurred into a dull smear of earth and sky. The air tasted of grit and exhaustion. Soldiers issued curt commands that cracked through the morning silence, their voices sharp against the steady thud of marching feet. Every step felt like an echo of the night, when their lives had shifted into uncertainty. A torn fragment of a travel chronicler's note, recovered centuries later from an eroded saddlebag, hinted that convoys like this moved relentlessly, day and night, allowing almost no rest. Seeing it now in motion, I understood how such journeys drain not only strength but memory, identity, and will. Anna adjusted her posture as the rope tugged at her wrists, wincing as she steadied herself. She glanced at a younger girl named Myrla, whose hands shook with cold more than fear. Anna leaned close, whispering encouragement, urging her to take slow breaths while guiding her toward the shared water skin that passed from captive to captive. Guilt pressed against Anna like a second weight. She believed she owed the others guidance, yet she could not offer freedom. Her eyes lingered on the distant mountains behind us, their shapes fading beneath drifting dust. Every few moments she turned back toward them, as though trying to keep hold of a life slipping farther away with each mile. The convoy moved through open plains where scattered shrubs leaned beneath the wind, their branches tapping lightly like fingers on a door that would never open. The soldiers marched with mechanical precision, their boots carving lines into the dry soil. One of them, a younger guard named Harun, avoided looking at the captives directly. When Anna stumbled, he lifted a hand as if to steady her, then hesitated, withdrawing before contact. I saw the conflict in his expression, a quiet struggle between duty and compassion, between orders given and humanity remembered. Each sunrise revealed new terrain and new uncertainty. Ridges of stone replaced the soft plains, then valleys folded into deep cuts in the land where sound echoed strangely, as if swallowed before it fully formed. The caravan halted only briefly, long enough to tighten bindings and distribute thin rations. Anna shared her portion with Myrla, breaking the bread with trembling fingers, murmuring that strength needed to be shared in places where hope grew scarce. By dusk, shadows stretched long across the trail, merging with the weary lines of the captives. Silence settled over them, heavy and layered, deepening the fear that the Empire's vast systems of control would strip away their identities long before they reached its distant gates, leaving them unsure of what parts of themselves would remain once the journey ended. Sunrise broke over Edirne with a muted glow that softened the outlines of the fortified compound. Yet the moment Sophia Radanik stepped through its outer gate, the light felt distant, as though the sky itself hesitated to acknowledge what unfolded beneath it. I walked beside the new arrivals as officials directed them through narrow passageways bordered by stone walls polished smooth by generations of footsteps. Sophia moved with careful restraint, clutching the small scrap of linen embroidered by her grandmother, the last physical memory of a home that already felt impossibly far behind her. The fabric trembled in her hand each time she heard a command barked across the courtyard, a reminder that she no longer controlled the rhythm of her days. Inside the main hall, sunlight filtered through slender lattice windows and cast long bars of gold across the tiled floor. Those glowing lines resembled the quiet boundaries shaping their new lives, creating a pattern neither harsh nor gentle, but unyielding. Administrators inspected each arrival with swift, practiced movements. An archival inspection list from that season would later preserve faint traces of this moment, recording altered names written in ink that had begun to fade, but had never lost their authority. I watched Sophia pause as a scribe reshaped the letters of her family name into something unfamiliar. Her expression tightened, not in rebellion, but in grief for a part of herself slipping beyond reach. The captives were led to living quarters arranged around a central courtyard, where a few bare trees swayed in the afternoon wind. The branches whispered softly, their sound mingling with hushed conversations as the girls tried to understand the expectations that would soon define their days. Sophia settled on a mat beside Myrla, a shy girl whose shoulders hunched inward as though she feared drawing notice. When night fell, Myrla's quiet tears soaked into the wool blanket she clung to, and Sophia whispered reassurances she wished she believed. Her inability to ease Myrla's fear pressed a heavy guilt into her chest, yet she continued to offer comfort, the gesture itself becoming a small act of defiance against the erasure surrounding them. In the days that followed, routines tightened like threads pulled through fabric. Sophia rose before dawn for lessons in languages she had never heard spoken in her village. She learned to move with measured composure beneath the watchful eyes of attendants who enforced discipline through silence rather than threat. The echo of guards' boots carried through each corridor like a distant drumbeat, steady and inevitable, reminding the girls that their world had narrowed to these walls alone. Still, when Sophia lifted her gaze toward the sliver of sky visible between rooftops, she held on to the faint hope that her future had not yet been written. She whispered that hope into the linen scrap she kept close, unsure whether the walls would allow such dreams to survive. Helena Draganik entered the training halls each morning with a quiet resolve that masked the turmoil swelling beneath her calm exterior. Candlelight shimmered along the polished marble floor, revealing faint reflections that wavered like uncertain memories. The halls breathed with the scent of ink, parchment, and damp wool, creating an atmosphere that pressed upon every newcomer. I observed Helena as she traced the grooves in the stone with her fingertips, as though seeking connection to something unclaimed by the Empire. Lessons began before sunrise, and each command echoed with purpose intended to reshape the identities of those gathered. Her instructor, Senum Hatun, walked between the rows with measured steps. She carried a ledger documenting daily progress, its binding worn from years of use. A preserved letter from an overseer described the students as in transition, yet that phrase failed to convey the emotional strain woven through each lesson. Helena learned court etiquette, unfamiliar languages, and ceremonial rituals, all delivered with precision intended to overwrite the foundation of her childhood. She struggled with posture exercises, her shoulders tightening whenever memories slipped into her awareness. She whispered her parents' names under her breath, anchoring herself against the weight of expectation. Senum Hatun noticed these murmured repetitions. Instead of chastising Helena, she placed a small piece of bread beside her workbook during a brief pause. The gesture carried no verbal explanation, yet it offered a soft moment of humanity within a system structured to minimize such exchanges. Helena accepted the bread with careful gratitude, sensing compassion hidden beneath Senum's disciplined exterior. However, she also understood that any kindness within the halls existed within boundaries shaped by watchful administrators. During language practice, Helena befriended a girl named Ileana, whose steady determination contrasted with Helena's quiet introspection. They exchanged glances of mutual reassurance when lessons intensified. Ileana shared stories of her village during stolen moments near the courtyard well, allowing both girls to remember lives overshadowed by distance. These memories, though fragile, strengthened Helena's resolve to preserve the essence of who she had been. Yet each evening, as the final bell echoed, the sense of transformation hovered over the hall like settling dust. Names were pronounced differently, gestures corrected, and voices trained into specific rhythms. Helena felt portions of her past slipping away, not through force but through relentless repetition. She feared that the day might come when her own voice would no longer sound familiar. When the lamps dimmed and silence overtook the corridors, Helena lingered near the threshold, staring at the faint light escaping from Senum's chamber. She wondered whether Senum carried her own story of adaptation, and whether survival within the capital required surrendering something essential. The question drifted with Helena into the dark hallway, following her as she stepped toward another day shaped by expectations she had not chosen. Her final breath before sleep carried a fragile vow that she would endure until she recovered every part of herself that the Empire sought to silence beneath its disciplined and unyielding order. Marina Choleric entered the outer wings of Topkapi Palace with trembling steps, overwhelmed by the grandeur and the secrets hidden in its chambers. Gold leaf gleamed along archways, yet the halls carried an unsettling quiet, broken only by the rustle of silk garments. I walked a short distance behind her, noting how her breath rose in shallow strands that dissolved in the cool air. A court inventory recorded Marina's presence among attendants assigned to serve senior officials, though it offered no detail on her inner turmoil. She paused near a column where lantern light traced wavering patterns across polished stone. Her fingers tightened around a small pouch that held the splinters she shaped into wooden crosses for girls who shared her fear. Each cross carried the faint scent of cedar, a scent that reminded her of the hillside chapel her family once tended. I saw her whisper a brief prayer before stepping onward, guided by the soft shuffle of other attendants moving through the passage. The palace revealed its power through silence rather than sound. Courtiers glided through gilded corridors, their expressions unreadable, their pace measured and distant. Marina felt the weight of their presence press against her shoulders like an unspoken command. She struggled to preserve fragments of her former identity, repeating her mother's name under her breath whenever anxiety threatened to consume her. In the evenings, she gathered with a few companions in a narrow service room where a single candle flickered against the walls. Myrla, one of the younger girls, often leaned against Marina for comfort, her trembling frame revealing the strain of constant vigilance. Marina offered her a carved cross, placing it gently into her palm as a reminder that they still held fragments of choice within a rigid system. Yet every day brought new tension. Officials inspected the attendants with precise gazes, and Marina sensed that any hesitation might draw unwanted scrutiny. Rumors drifted through the palace of transfers to distant estates, spoken in hushed tones by kitchen workers and scribes who feared becoming part of such lists. One night, the echo of approaching boots rolled through the outer hall, and Marina felt her breath falter. The girls around her stiffened, waiting for the sound to pass or to stop at their door. The uncertainty etched itself into Marina's thoughts, leaving her to wonder whether the palace intended to keep her hidden within its walls or send her into an unknown future. When the corridor finally fell quiet again, Marina released a slow breath that trembled with exhausted relief. She knew the silence offered no safety, only a pause in the relentless uncertainty that shaped each passing hour within the imperial court. That night lingered. Ivana Velik stood in the dim palace courtyard long after the final bell faded, her breath curling into the chilled night. Air as though the world exhaled a warning she did not yet understand. Lamps swung lightly from iron hooks, their wavering flames drawing trembling shapes along the wet stones. Her thoughts drifted to Florina, the younger girl she had promised to protect, a promise whispered in secret during their earliest days in the palace when uncertainty clung to them like a second skin. Now the announcement of relocation unsettled every attendant, for relocation meant distance, and distance meant erasure from familiar bonds that had become their fragile refuge. Ivana felt dread coil within her stomach as she listened to murmured speculation threading through the corridors, each voice hinting at harsh climates, unfamiliar households, and expectations cloaked in uncertainty. She found Florina seated beneath an olive tree in the courtyard, her small hands folded around a wool scarf gifted by another attendant before winter. Florina lifted her gaze when Ivana approached, revealing eyes wide with fear rather than confusion. Ivana knelt beside her, brushing a fallen leaf from her shoulder. The gesture steadied neither of them. A damaged account from a frontier garrison, uncovered centuries later, mentioned the arrival of young attendants transported under imperial order, though it remained vague about their fates. Ivana wondered whether that account referred to departures like the one now looming over their heads. Florina whispered a hesitant question about whether they would be separated. The words broke something inside Ivana, for she had no certainty to offer. She wished to promise safety, yet false hope felt as cruel as silence. Her mind drifted to her own village, to her mother's voice reciting evening prayers, to the scent of river reeds near her childhood home. Those memories grew sharper when fear pressed closest. She squeezed Florina's hands, feeling the pulse of a child who depended entirely on her resolve. Torches flared brighter as officials entered the courtyard, their shadows stretching long across the ground like arms reaching toward those chosen to depart. Ivana felt her resolve harden into a fragile kind of courage. She debated whether to volunteer in Florina's place, knowing that the journey would be exhausting and the expectations unknown, yet the thought of Florina leaving alone hollowed her heart. The world had demanded impossible choices from them since the day they were taken from their villages. She had endured each loss by summoning quiet strength. Now another test emerged, one that cut more deeply than any before. Florina trembled as the names were read. Ivana rose slowly, fastening her fingers around Florina's hands one final time before stepping forward. She lifted her chin, steadying her breath as she prepared to speak her decision, though she did not know whether bravery or despair guided her voice. The courtyard waited in heavy silence for the words that would alter both of their paths. Darina Iliv walked through the palace's side gate carrying sealed baskets for delivery, yet her steps faltered when she heard distant shouts echoing across the city's lower quarters. Smoke from hearth fires drifted upward, mingling with the restless dust kicked by hurried feet. The air felt charged, as though the very stones beneath her carried the memory of unrest that had stirred before dawn. She followed the road toward the market square, allowed out only because her growing reliability had earned her limited errands beyond the palace walls. What she saw unsettled her deeply. Families pressed together near shuttered stalls, their expressions etched with exhaustion as they argued over rising taxes and forced levies that strained their livelihoods. Darina paused beside a pillar as a group of men pounded their fists against a wooden crate, demanding fairness in voices sharpened by desperation. Children clung to their mothers, their faces smudged with dust. The scene struck Darina with painful clarity, for she saw echoes of her own past in their fear, the same fear she had felt when her village fractured under unbearable pressures. A torn dispatch later recovered from court archives confirmed that provincial uprisings disturbed the imperial household that season, though the account remained restrained, avoiding details that revealed the human cost. Darina watched soldiers advance into the square, their boots striking the stone in measured rhythm as they attempted to contain the growing unrest. As the crowd shifted, Darina approached an elderly woman who struggled to lift her fallen basket. Darina helped her gather scattered figs, while the woman murmured that families had been divided by conscription, leaving homes empty and futures uncertain. Darina felt the weight of those words settle inside her. She knew how systems of authority could fracture lives quietly yet completely. She remembered the day her own village emptied in fear, the moment she lost sight of her younger brother among running villagers. That me. Maury returned now with sharp clarity. The tension in the market rose with each passing moment. Voices cracked under pressure, and the soldiers' presence intensified rather than soothed the turmoil. Darina sensed that the empire's reach had extended too far, tightening its grip until the people beneath it could no longer breathe without strain. She feared that if unrest spread, more families would face the same dislocation she had endured. A soldier called out for the crowd to disperse, yet his voice wavered. Even the authorities sensed the instability building beneath them. Darina stepped back into the shelter of an alleyway, pressing her hand to her chest as she tried to steady her breath. She felt the storm approaching with the certainty of someone who had lived through collapse before. The city trembled in a way that warned her the upheaval had only just begun. Years later, Mila Stanek, once carried away as a frightened child, walked through the ruins of her birth village with a slow and reverent pace. I moved beside her, feeling the weight that clung to every shattered wall and abandoned hearth. Ash coated the stones like a thin veil of memory, and Mila knelt to touch a charred support beam that had once upheld her family's roof. In her hand she carried a faded page from an old imperial ledger, its edges worn from years of being folded and unfolded in moments of doubt. The page listed the village not by its name, but by an assigned classification, a cold reminder of how easily individual lives disappeared within distant systems of authority. Mila read the lines softly, then lowered her gaze, as though acknowledging the document meant acknowledging the fractures it had carved into her life. She walked toward the remains of her family's doorway, where splintered wood jutted outward like ribs protecting a vanished heart. Her fingers traced the frame, and I sensed a mixture of grief and strength rising within her, shaped by years of survival in unfamiliar households. Wildflowers pushed through the cracked earth around her feet, their colors bright against the gray ruin, as though the land itself insisted on remembering what empire had tried to forget. Mila spoke of the girls taken with her, recalling Florina, Myrla, and Anna, each name carrying a history of fear, resilience, and unanswered endings. Some had vanished into distant estates, others into service within unfamiliar halls, their stories scattered like embers carried by wind. The suffering they endured lingered across generations, shaping identities in ways no record could fully describe, even when names appeared in household accounts or inspection ledgers. Mila's eyes glistened as she surveyed the silent foundations, and I felt that she returned not seeking closure but seeking the fragments of herself that history had scattered. She spoke of reclaiming her identity, yet doubt shadowed her voice, for reclaiming did not undo the years spent under an authority that had once dictated every movement. Wind rustled the grass around us with a tone that felt both familiar and distant, the sound rising like an echo refusing to fade. Mila stood in the center of the abandoned path, holding the ledger page as though it were both a burden and a compass, guiding her toward a truth she feared to confront. Yet as the sun lowered behind the shattered rooftops, she understood that healing required witnessing every scar the empire had left behind, even if the act reopened old wounds she carried with her. She stepped forward, breathing deeply as evening shadows gathered around her in quiet resolve.